Hi, I'm Jenna Pratt, and I'm a screen composer based in Sydney, Australia. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and fear. Music had always been a part of my life, but taking the leap into studying it formally was really daunting, especially growing up. I was sort of taught that having a career in music wasn't a viable option, and also studying at university wasn't something that I would be able to do. What gave me the courage was realizing that not taking the chance would leave me wondering what if forever, and also the fact that I was so unhappy with what I was doing in my life. And the only thing that ever really brought me joy was when I was writing and making music. So that's sort of what I focused on, was my love of creating and the curiosity of learning and seeing where I could go in the music industry. The most important lesson I took from my music studies is the value of continuous growth. So, my music studies taught me to keep pushing myself, to never stop learning, and to view it as a lifelong journey. I also learned the importance of not only networking, but building a supportive community and learning how to balance creativity with understanding the business side of music. It really depends on the project. Sometimes a particular sound or texture sparks an idea, while other times it's an emotion or a narrative moment that I want to highlight. Often it's a combination of all three that sort of evolve together until the piece really starts to find its shape. Um, when I'm starting a composition, I usually start by creating a sound palette that fits the story and, developing a few motifs, coming up with chord progressions, and sort of deciding where I want the piece to go. One of the tricks that I do is sometimes I might start at the climax of the piece and then work my way backwards so that I can sort of see how big I want the piece to build. I also consider how I want the audience to feel when they experience the music, while also making sure that it serves the story. I like to think of each project as its own little world. So, for example, if I'm working on a true crime series, I focus on building tension and atmosphere. And with games, it's more about interactivity and the themes. And with short films, I'm really thinking like, how can I tell the story in such a short amount of time? I like to try and immerse myself fully in each world and, the characters and what's happening. And that sort of makes it easier for me to move naturally between genres and different mediums. Since I usually work with virtual instruments and MIDI, hearing my music played live is always a surreal experience. And, getting the chance to visit Evergreen Studios over in LA and to hear my music performed in such an incredible space made it even more special. And also, it happened to be my first trip to LA, and that was something that had been in the works for a very long time. Originally, I had booked a trip to LA that was in 2020. So that obviously got pushed because of the pandemic. And then, a whole bunch of things happened. And it wasn't until the beginning of this year that I actually got the chance to go over. And it just so happened to be at the same time as this showcase where my music was being performed. I think one of the most challenging projects I've been on is when I had to score a short film on a super tight deadline. So trying to capture, the emotional arc of the characters, working on a super constrained budget. These were all sort of things that I had to consider. I think I had about 2 weeks to get the music done. And but luckily, the director that I was working with was incredible, very collaborative and easy to work with. It does become tricky balancing the creativity with the technical demands, and also when you're on such a time crunch. What I do is I try and break everything into smaller pieces. I also love spreadsheets. I love writing things down. So often, if I'm working on a project, I just like to jot down my thoughts so that I can sort of see everything in front of me. And that really helps center me and helps me decide what I'm going to be focusing on. I also, sometimes realize that my job isn't to compose the most amazing piece of music for every single project. As long as the music works with the visuals and it serves the story, that's sort of the most important thing. Mentors like Caitlin Yo have taught me the value of adaptability and really listening. And also, one thing that she always reminds me of is to keep carving my own path, which I think is a really important lesson, because often I think when composers are just starting out, they try and sort of mimic what the established composers are doing. And I definitely was guilty of doing that when I first started out. I thought if I could write like my favorite composers, if I could copy their careers, then, that would be how my career trajectory would go. But I've sort of learned over the years that everyone is on their own path. Caitlin also shared practical tools with me that have been really invaluable, especially now that I'm moving into longer form projects. I think, having a mentor is so important. It gives you the chance to learn, grow, and see how someone else in your field approaches their craft. And you might learn something or take away something that you can implement into your own music. The Australian music community is really supportive and collaborative. Being part of it pushes me to try new things while also staying connected to the stories and the sounds that we share. It also, gives me a sense of belonging and motivates me to keep raising my own standards just by seeing all of the talented Australian composers and, just in general, songwriters and musicians. I think that there is a lot of talent in Australia that needs to get a lot more global recognition. Music is such a powerful way to connect audiences to a story. It instantly conveys emotion, joy, tension, and makes moments memorable. For example, like an iconic theme song for a TV show. It also sets the tone, helps to, guide the pacing, and helps the story stand out in a crowded media landscape. Essentially, I think music doesn't just support a story, it helps people, feel the story and oftentimes helps them remember. When I face rejection or doubt, I remind myself that these moments are part of the journey, not a reflection of my worth. It's a lot easier for me now to deal with rejection than when I was first starting out. I try to see setbacks as opportunities to learn, refine my craft, and grow. I always allow myself to feel a brief window of disappointment if I, get rejected from an opportunity. But I always, reconnect with my love of music. And I also keep in mind that if an opportunity doesn't work out, it likely wasn't the right fit for me in that moment. And that perspective helps me to keep moving forward. When I face moments of doubt, I just try and think to myself that it's better to try than to not try, and also really just trying to trust my own instinct. And, if I write some music and, for some reason a client doesn't like it, it's really not the end of the world. I just go back to the drawing board and then I'll just try and come up with another piece of music. I would say, trust your instincts, embrace the uncertainty. I think taking the leap into music can be scary. I think that's often where the most growth happens, is when you're outside of your comfort zone. I think the best thing to do is to surround yourself with supportive people, stay curious and don't be afraid to make mistakes. I think making mistakes just helps you to learn and to grow as a composer. I think life is too short not to try, not to sound like a total cliche. But I think it's better to put yourself out there than to always wonder what if. Looking back over the last 10 years, the moments I regret most are the times where I held back or didn't go for an opportunity because I was too scared. I think if you're really passionate about music, you'll fight to make a career happen, because the alternative for you won't be an option. Right now, I'm writing music for a mix of projects, which is exciting, including a couple of short films, my first feature film, and I've also been writing music for a video game. I'm really excited over the next year just to keep exploring new collaborations and also to keep pushing myself out of my comfort zone, and also just explore the boundaries of how music can tell stories and also connect with audiences in unexpected ways.